Section 7. Apply what you learn. Prototyping and blocking out a scene. We're going to use the skills you learned earlier in the course to flesh out the scene called IVB. But first, let's take a look at some guiding principles for building a scene. A scene can be broadly divided into several rings. Objects which are further from the player's reach are in a further ring. The four rings are the foreground with interactive objects, the foreground occluders, the objects in the near background, and the objects in the far background. Objects which are more distant can be of lower resolution and do not interact with the player. The objects which are furthest away are in the far background. The player can never reach these objects, and they are far enough away that they have basically no depth. The far background can be built of simple objects such as image planes, and does not need to be made up of geometry. Since the far background is always in view, it should always be made up of only simple geometry and simple objects, or of objects which may be converted to a very low level of detail. The near background, unlike the far background, consists of objects which may be close to the player, but which the player cannot touch. Novice scene builders often leave out the near background because it would involve adding a lot of additional work for little functional payoff. One performance trick is to place a large near background object in the center of the scene, and then have the player progress by moving around it. This object both becomes the focal point of the scene, for example a giant fortress or a tree, but also serves to obstruct the player's view so the scene can be easily partitioned. The next layer is a layer that can interact with the player. It is the foreground occluders. An occluder is an object that obstructs the player's view. This helps in reducing rendering costs. An occluder is a large filler object that may be well decorated, but at its core is made up of only very simple geometry. For example, a simple wall on the side of a building is made up of a very low detail mesh, often simply a cube. The innermost layer is the player itself and everything that the player can interact with. Non-player characters, interactive props, and pickups go here. Objects in the innermost layer must have the most detail and polish, because the player can move around them freely and get the camera very close to viewing them. Let's talk about placing objects. The human mind can keep 5 plus or minus 2 things in their immediate frame of attention. You can use this as a guide for determining how much duplication of props you can get away with before the world feels repetitive and inorganic. Even though we can only focus on 3 to 7 things, that doesn't mean that we won't notice something glaring. It also doesn't mean that you can put into a frame 7 things which are not duplicated and the 8th duplicated thing won't be obvious. It just means that the player will have a running memory of about the last 7 big important things they saw. This means that if 7 large-ish things went out of frame, and there are 7 new big things in the current frame, the player generally shouldn't notice. This means you can usually duplicate unimportant background objects as the player goes around the corner. Or you can duplicate background objects as long as there are many foreground objects which make that occluder feel as if it wasn't the same as the player saw just a moment ago. Sometimes obvious sameness can be used to your advantage. Many architectural features use repeated themes, such as symmetry and uniformity. In these cases, it's actually more obvious when a non-repeated element occurs. To demonstrate a poor choice of background object, we've marked 2 background objects in yellow. Suppose these were 2 duplicated objects that didn't really fit the rest of the theme. If there was only one such object, we would call it an accent to the theme. Something that stands out intentionally, such as a sculpture. But as soon as you have 2 or more such things in the same area without any symmetry, it feels as if they were placed at random rather than intentionally, and so both objects feel out of place. A common design trope in games is to put the player in a valley, because that form of terrain makes it easy to restrict the view and movement of the player. But this can make your game feel claustrophobic. A game feels much more open if you have some coves and oceans, or some grasslands or deserts that stretch out into the horizon. If you've done a good job designing your level with the ring model, it usually feels like the level is much bigger than it actually is. This can cause the player to try and go out exploring places where they shouldn't be. So let's discuss the level boundaries. A level boundary is where the foreground becomes the background. The level boundary is essentially a wall. If you have a simple design, like a walled city, this is very easy to do. Simply prevent the player from getting anywhere that could possibly go over the wall. That being said, the best kind of walls don't actually look like walls. A wall can be as simple as a fence or a pile of debris. To prevent the player from going where they shouldn't, we often use an invisible wall. An invisible wall is a large collision volume that prevents the player from progressing. Invisible walls are necessary but universally despised by game players. An invisible wall should only be used as a last resort to prevent what is called a sequence break. A sequence break is when the player enters a trigger volume that sets a progress flag prematurely. Some sequence breaks can be game-breaking. For example, entering a boss area without the equipment to defeat that boss, and then respawning in an area where you cannot move backwards if you are killed by that boss. This state is called a soft lock. The player is both unable to progress and unable to move backwards. Finally, when laying out the scene, it is important to make sure you have a plan. We're going to use the plan we generated earlier for Ivaby. But notice that there are not a lot of repeated elements or shapes, and the building shapes are irregular. Since this plan was machine generated, there's not a lot we can do about that. If this aspect of your conceptual plan is inconvenient, ignore it, and use the plan as a rough layout for where the player can move. After rough placement, your level will undergo many iterations to finalize the placement anyway. You can name your placeholder prefabs either according to form or function. If you don't yet have art, you can roughly approximate the cost of laying out a scene by determining how many such placeholders you need to replace with art. Using what you know about making placeholder prefabs from the earlier chapters, let's start laying out Ivaby. I've gone ahead and populated some of the purple district with color-coded cubes that will eventually be different varieties of buildings. If you would prefer something more visually appealing, or need a better sense of scale, you can purchase some inexpensive placeholder or even final art from the asset store in themed sets.